There are a couple of things that we believe that government is going to have to do and do differently if it's really going to make a significant difference. The first is it needs to adopt a focused strategy to encourage investment. We don't have the deep pockets to compete in every area, and we need to be very conscious that there are some things that are deeply challenging to us. The first is that there is what's called a knowledge spillover effect. Now, it's a bit of a technical term, but it explains why energy R&D has traditionally been supported by the public sector. If you create a piece of intellectual property in a university, in an early stage business, and you want to protect that intellectual property as it goes right the way through to market, then there are some real challenges, particularly in the energy space, where it's quite hard to lock in the value of that intellectual property and retain it all the way through to the market. A pharmaceutical company has no difficulty. It can develop its own drugs in its own labs, and it can basically go right the way through the process to a product on the shelf, whilst owning and holding on to the value that it has created. It doesn't exist in the energy sector in the same way, and that has led to a very fragmented industry in many parts of the renewable space in particular, as people try to find ways of holding on to their intellectual property and get the business value out of it. So that's something that we know exists. It's something we know we can help tackle. It's something that exists around the world, and it is primarily the reason for having public support in this particular area. The second challenge is all to do with high capital requirements for the development and deployment of technologies. Again, there are some technologies where capital requirements are reasonably low until the point at which you reach the market and you then need to promote the product very strongly into the market. Not so in many low-carbon technologies. The early stages of development in universities can be reasonably cost-effective, and then you get into the scale-up to prove to investors, to prove to the market, to prove to governments for support mechanisms that something actually works and works at scale. And at that point, what started off as being maybe a couple of £1 million becomes tens of millions of pounds, and that's very, very expensive. So a real challenge in terms of getting the finance right to scale up some of these technologies through the middle stages before the market has really got going. And that's very, very challenging. Lastly, I come back to the point about the industry structure being fragmented. And it's a question of ownership. Who actually wants to own technology? There's no doubt that if you have a good piece of intellectual property and you want to innovate with it, then you want to own it. And you want to hold on to that ownership for as long as you can. The reality is, though, that if you try to do it on your own, you're likely to get to the point, as I've just said, where you can't afford the next stage of development. So how does the transition go from you owning it to you owning a part of it and another owner coming alongside? The reality is that not that many people these days want to own technology. A lot of sectors have actively moved out of owning technology. My own background in oil and gas companies have, broadly speaking, moved out of owning technology. Utilities are now driven down a very, very low cost route. They don't have the capacity internally, or indeed the will to want to own technologies going forward. They want to use technologies. They want to be able to buy a technology that is cost effective and has a warranty. They're not owners. They're not natural owners of technology going forward. So these are all some of the challenges that we need to get around and work around. We need to prioritize because we don't have the funding required to do this on our own. So we do need to prioritize and focus very strongly on the areas where we have a comparative advantage. And I think that applies to the UK, and I think it applies to funding specifically allocated to any region within the UK, and Northern Ireland will be a very good example of that. And lastly, we believe that innovations must be customized. The one thing we've learned from all our experience is that at the end of the day, you've got to customize what you have to offer. Generic solutions aren't clear enough. We are very much specialists in the low-carbon space. We've looked at over 1,800 R&D applications over the last 8 years. We've supported over 150 projects, and 65% of those have gone on to achieve either commercial success, realized patents, or got third-party investors on board, but only by being very focused on the commercialization aspect of that. That's fine for one early stage of the development, but at a later stage, you need to see those companies grow in and get their first external investors. We've had 82 incubators within the Carbon Trust Incubator Scheme. They have collectively raised just over 84 million of private equity coming out of that scheme going forward. And we invest as a venture capital investor. We have an FSA-regulated business, and we've invested in 17 businesses. And what worries me there is that actually we are the most prolific investor in clean tech early stage companies in Europe. A number of other large venture capital and private equity houses have pulled out, and we are now the most prolific. And that isn't very much. 17 companies, relatively small investments, that isn't very much, really. In the US, we'd be doing 5, 10 times more. We've created 3 renewable businesses, and we've also just been allocated a significant chunk of new stimulus money, essentially focused at 3 areas, but they're all very relevant here in Northern Ireland. Offshore wind, where we are very active in working with the industry to bring together capacity to develop large-scale R&D and demonstration schemes, 50 million plus. Wave and tidal stream technology, where we believe the UK has a distinctive advantage that we believe will come good in years to come. And then venture capital going beyond the narrow remit of wet renewables into the broader clean tech space. But that's significant funding of over 50 million that we have to invest over the next 18 months or so. So it's an interesting challenge that we face. What kind of support is actually available for Northern Ireland low carbon technologies and businesses? Well, it comes in a number of guises. We provide support as the Carbon Trust, but we provide it alongside 2 other organizations that are very active in this space, and I'll very briefly outline what they do. The Energy Technologies Institute and the Technology Strategy Board. The Energy Technologies Institute is essentially a public-private partnership between 6 industrial partners, E.ON, EDF, Shell BP, Caterpillar, and Rolls-Royce. And they essentially bring their industrial capability to bear alongside government funding to do technology development using their core skills and using their industrial base. So they are very active in certain areas, and in some areas like offshore wind, we both run very significant programs that literally join up and are complementary in their design. The technology, and it's a private company, it's actually a private partnership. The Technology Strategy Board is an NDPB. It's got a much broader remit than just clean tech. And that actually has a great advantage because it does have the ability to reach across a much broader range of technology developments and work in that way. It's very effective as the Technology Strategy Board. Again, we partner with it in a whole number of areas where we believe that that cross-fertilization and bringing in skills from outside the clean tech and energy sector is very important. And lastly, the Carbon Trust. So we are here as an independent company. We are beneficiaries of significant government funding, and at the end of the day, we believe that accelerating commercialization is our sweet spot. It's what we have done in the past, it's what we are known for, and it's what we do in this country and elsewhere.